when I tell you that this is the third time I'm making this video, this will be less spontaneous than it was in the previous two iterations, but who knows. Sigh. Guys, I said such smart things, and I'm not going to remember them. Anyway, so this is another tarot tips video. This one's going to focus entirely on the majors, and what I want to illustrate are really three tips for you, three points, three things that I think are really helpful. They have, the court cards have a reputation, court cards specifically have a reputation for being difficult to read, and they are, for many people. But the trumps, I think, or the majors can possess or present an equal challenge, because one of the things that's happened over the history of tarot is that the esoteric thinkers have come along and adopted it, have painted a lot of spiritual symbolism on it. And that's all fine, particularly if you're doing that kind of reading, or you're doing path working, or you're doing spiritual development or intention setting. If you're doing a reading, for example, about like what's going to happen at work today or what's going to happen in the meeting today, that spiritual lacquer can actually make your interpretation work harder. So the purpose of this particular reading is, or this particular tip, is to share with you the idea that the size and scope of the trumps or the majors matches the size and scope of the question that you're asking. I talk about this a lot with friends, and the theory, I think, if you trust tarot, is that the right cards come up at the right time. But that doesn't mean that they're always easy to interpret, and so a really troubling or weird card can come up in a reading that feels sort of incongruous. The Hanged Man, for example, in the question about what's going to happen in the meeting today, like what are the traditional associations of the Hanged Man that we have? And it can have a lot to do with spiritual awakening, spiritual shifts, changing your perspective, changing your point of view. There's this suffering before death of the awakening, in a lot of Golden Dawn and a lot of shamanic traditions and the hero's journey even, there is this sense that you have to suffer and die before you awaken to your spiritual truth, and so the Hanged Man I've heard described as part of that cycle. In a meeting at work, likely none of those things, none of those transcendent things are going to happen for you. But you look at who knows, but you look at the card and you look at the Hanged Man and you think about what in the context of the question a card of that size means. Well, what it does is it shrinks to match the question. And so, no, you probably won't have a spiritual awakening during that meeting. You might suffer and find it endless, which has a very Hanged Man quality to it. Or you might have a perception shift, meaning that the way you're thinking about the project or the way you're thinking about the company or whatever changes. And so that at the end of the meeting, your perception has shifted and you've had a Hanged Man moment. The cards do that, they expand and contract to match the scope of the question that you've asked. And I think that is really helpful to remember, particularly if you're a new reader and you're sort of lapping up all of the many, many great books and you're sort of absorbing all of these spiritual associations, but you ask a question about work, what's going to happen at work, and you get the Hanged Man, and so it can be tough and overwhelming to interpret that. And so what you want to do is reduce the scope to match what you're saying, what the reading is asking about, so that they're on the same level. And that's something that tarot does really well. The Tower, is another example of that. Death is an example of that. These are big, scary concepts in many ways. If you're doing a reading about what's going to happen in the meeting today and you get the Tower, it can be very tempting to think, oh my god, the company's going under, or I'm going to get fired. But unless there's warning signs and contextual clues that you've been gathering leading up to this point, probably that's not the case. Probably a project that you're working on is going to fall apart, and this happens all the time. It happens in my world all the time. You're about ready to launch and someone comes out and says, oh, we have feedback on this, and suddenly 2 months worth of work is down the drain. That to me is more likely to be what a Tower represents in the case of a reading like this. I thought I had the Tower pulled out, but I had to redo everything. So the scope matches the question, and it is the right card at the right moment, but it's reduced in size to match what's happening in the world. One reason why I was so put off by the Urban Tarot and its use of the World Trade Center on 9/11 as the Tower card is that there's no other way to read that other than a once-in-a-lifetime kind of destruction that had ramifications for, and still has ramifications. Those are Tower moments, yes, but like in life, if you're a reader like me, you're not really reading for situations like that very often. And oftentimes, you don't know you've had a moment like that until after you've been through it. You just don't. It's like, I'm trying to think of like the context of a reading where, it would really, the Tower would really be something like that. And I think it would have to be a question that was that specific. I really can't imagine that. I talk about this occasionally. It's something that came up a lot. Tarot readers talked about this back then. The Tower card was coming up a lot for us at that time. Was it trying to tell us something? I don't know how it could, because how could you imagine that? How could you imagine that? You can't. We don't live in a country, if you're in the United States, where that happens much. I mean, there are parts of the world where that kind of violence, maybe not at that scale, happens all the time, but that's not something a reader could have known. And so I think it's important for us as readers to scale the meaning of the card to match the kind of question we're being asked. It is possible that this could be that you go into that meeting today and you find out the company's closing its doors. That's totally possible. But again, it's less likely, and you would need other cards to tell you that, and a question that may be more specifically addressed. What is the state of our business right now based on the stock market collapse or whatever? You know what I mean? Is this going to be a good day on the stock market? Probably not. Is the stock market going to crash? Usually, if that's happening, there's a lot of signs beforehand. So my guess is likely no, that wouldn't be the case. But again, other cards will give you context and will give you clues. So that's my first tip. The major arcana cards, the trumps, reduce or expand in scale to match the size of the question that you're asking, and your interpretation should factor that in and can factor that in. So that's tip number one. Tip number two is that the trumps, the majors, are metaphors for experience. And let's talk about what a metaphor is. When we were talking about the majors a lot, we use the term archetypes, and I think there's a similar feeling to this, but I've always found the word archetype a little it's just a little vague to me, to most people, because I don't think most people sit down and read Carl Jung and his exploration of archetypes. If you do, then and there's a good book about that, by the way, which has just been re-released, and I don't think I have it within my, Jung and Tarot. I think it might have another name now, but it's by Sally Nichols, from what I can see from here. It's published by Weiser Books. So anyway, metaphor I prefer over archetype for my own understanding of how these cards work. So what's a metaphor? It's illustrated in a great story I once heard Joseph Campbell tell in a documentary about him. He's being interviewed by a young, sort of arrogant interviewer on the radio. And the interview was going off about how metaphors are lies and Joseph Campbell's full of crap. And Joseph Campbell says in the course of the interview, he realizes that this young interviewer does not know what a metaphor is. And so he decides to get a little cocky himself. And he says, well, give me an example of a metaphor, to the interviewer. And the interviewer says, she's like the wind. I don't think that's the metaphor that he came up with, or the example he came up with, but it's what I remember in this version of the story. Anyway, Campbell says that's not a metaphor, that's a simile. She's like the wind is a simile. A metaphor is she is the wind. And then there's a little charming exchange between them, and it's a funny story, and Joseph Campbell is great in the telling of it. But the point is that the metaphor is she is the wind. That is so different and so much more powerful than she's like the wind. It is the totality of her personhood. She isn't like the wind. She isn't windish. She is the wind. And that stirs up, it triggers a whole host of images and associations that tell you so much about who this person is. Now, it's also a little risky because my impression of what the wind is could be different from yours. And so when I say she's the wind, I may be imagining a hurricane, and you may be imagining a lovely meadow in a breezy day. But our job as readers actually is to make the metaphor clear for others, both to ourselves or our clients or our friends, whoever we're reading for. We are interpreters of metaphor as readers. And the cards are the metaphor. They are visual metaphors. And so when you're looking at the cards, they are representing a tower-esque experience. This experience is the tower. It is not literally death. It is not literally someone being hung from a tree. It is not literally, you don't, draw the emperor and you're going to become king that day. The metaphor is emperorness. You are the emperor in that meeting. And so what does that mean? It means you take over, you don't listen to other people, you are bullheaded, and you're stubborn, and you're a mansplainer, for example. That is the metaphor of your behavior. The emperor is the metaphor. The descriptions of them are how we translate that into. So if the question is what's going to happen in this meeting today, someone, maybe you, maybe someone else, the other cards will give us context. Thank you for having other cards in the reading, everybody. Will tell you someone is going to do this. Someone is going to be the emperor today. And that means he's going to exhibit these behaviors we associate with the emperor. So these emperor-like qualities, that is the experience. Same thing with the tower. It is the experience of this. This is the metaphor of what's going to happen in this meeting today. You will feel at the end of the meeting the way this experience looks, but it's probably not going to be because the company is closing down. It's probably because you spent 2 months working in this project and someone comes along and says, oh, by the way, we forgot to tell you about these new regulations. Everything's changing. You have to start again, and it's due tomorrow. So the trumps are metaphors of experience. They do not describe a literal event most of the time. That's most of the time. If you're doing a reading about what's going to happen and the fool shows up, I would be wary about what I would say and do in that case, because it's probably an indication that you or someone is going to look like a fool at the end of it, right? That's literal. I did a reading once about getting a new car and I got the Chariot. That's literal. Oftentimes, though, they are working as a metaphor of the feeling of an experience. She's like the wind. He's like the emperor. She's like the high priestess. He's like the high priestess. What does that mean? Well, he's withholding, he's secretive, he's a little haughty. That tells us a lot about the experience and the person by describing it. And the court cards work a lot that way too. They are a little bit different, but they do that. So that is tip number 3, which is to look at the trumps or the majors as a metaphor of an experience, and then how to translate that metaphor into a meaning that makes sense in the context of the question and the other cards. An example that I will give you is that a while ago, I posted this on Instagram, this was actually the impetus for the video, is that I did a reading for myself, and I often do this when I haven't been reading for a while. I'll go and post a bunch of readings on Instagram for myself, and I'll ask a question, and the question that I usually use, sometimes I'll do a, oh God, I can't remember what I used to do. I whatever it was, I didn't like it, and I changed it to what's today's mission. And so I had a reading where I got the death card, and I talked about how, as the first card, I talked about how after 20 years, I still view that card with a little bit of like, oh my God, I'm going to die. But in the context of the question, what's my mission, that's not what it meant. And what I had to do is figure out what the metaphor was. And so I said, what's the metaphor of death? It's ending, termination, stopping, killing, harvesting, all of these things. And then I had to look at the other cards in the spread, and it was the Star and the Eight of Cups. And the Star represents GPS or direction or compass points for me. And the Eight of Cups, even though this was a reading with a pip deck, I had the association of the Rider-Waite-Smith Eight of Cups in my head as movement because of the Star. The Star made me think of that way. GPS movement. And so suddenly, kill GPS movement, I got this reading that said to me, turn off the GPS and just follow your instincts, because of cups as intuitive. And so what I had to do was translate the metaphors of the cards into a reading that made sense to me that day. And that was appropriate for the question that I asked. And sometimes literally it's like taking a piece of paper and I say, okay, what are these metaphorical associations? I write them down, and then I'll do the next card, and then I'll start looking for words that kind of make a sentence, and then I'll do that a couple times and say, well, compare it back to the question, compare it to the motion of the car, how people are looking at each other, and figure out what the meaning is that way. Sometimes when I'm reading for myself, I literally have to do it on paper because it's the only way I can force myself to do the math. And sometimes it feels like math, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you see the cards and within a few minutes or a few seconds you know immediately what they are. But sometimes you do have to translate beyond the instinct or the bias we have for or against cards. I mean, the Fool is one of my favorite cards in the tarot, but in context, in a more literal way, it's not a spiritual journey, it's acting like a fool. And so, sometimes the metaphor is literal. The third tip is really a little bit more about reading with multiple cards, not just trumps. And I did this randomly, but I came up with the reading and I liked it. So in my previous attempt, so we'll just replace it. So I pulled the Moon as an example, and then we had the Queen and King of Cups. And this is I liked this combo because this is a reading that would, when I was starting out, give me a panic attack, because I have 2 court cards and a trump card, and the Moon is not an easy court card to read, trump card to read for folks, because what is it? It's nebulous. And so this reading can be tricky. When I have a reading where I'm a little stumped, if there is a trump card or a major card in the spread, what I let that do is I let it become the star of the play, right? Because it's a trump card. It trumps the others. It is literally in the gameplay of tarot, it is a high-scoring card. So I let it behave that way, and I decide that this is the main actor in the play, and so I let the card tell me what the actor is doing, the verb. So then, as the most important card in the spread, it becomes the most important part of the sentence, which is usually the action that's being described. And so I'll say, well, what does the Moon do, and how does it do it? So I look for the verb and the adverb, or the verb and the adjective. And so what does the Moon do? It shines, it reflects, it changes, it cycles, it is dim, and I start associating, and then I look at these cards and I know that these are a couple in some way, they're partners in some way, because they're a pair, the Queen and the King. I know that they're grounded, they're practical. This is probably not, I don't have a question, it's easier to do this with a question, but I can glean things from the cards, so they're maybe business partners, again, because pentacles and money, right? So that's there. And so then I start to make associations and look at and I say, okay, the Queen is the only one who's looking at this. And so I see a relationship, this person's looking away. And so I see partners, and one of them knows the relationship is changing and the other one doesn't want to face it. And this was an example where the Moon was first, but it wouldn't matter. It changes the context a little bit, right? But I could still read the Moon as the verb, but now they're both looking in different directions. So it doesn't really matter where they fall. I can do it. It's how they're looking that can give me more context. So now I have partners of some kind, and their relationship is changing, and they don't recognize it. And so the trump card in a spread can be your gateway in if you just stop and think about what it does, what it is, and what it's doing. Something that I learned from Camellia Elias in her Lenormand class was to look past the associations that we have and look at the function of the thing. What does it do? What does the Moon do? It changes, it cycles, it orbits, it pulls. And that's another way I could look at this too. Here are 2 people who are attracted to each other who don't even know it. And there's this animal connection, but they're resisting it because they're so practical and they're both really grounded and they're at work, but they really want each other. That's another way to look at this. So you look at the function of the object or the thing that's being represented rather than the associations we have for it. And I think that that's really helpful in tarot as well. What's the function of death? Where did he go? What's he doing? He's harvesting, he's reaping, he's farming. And then we have 2 earthy people, and so I have a very different context at that point. And so that is the third tip, is to think about the trump card as the main actor and figure out how and what they're doing, and how it relates to the other cards. And that can trigger, again, associations for you. And then the sort of bonus tip there is this thing I stole from Commander Elias, which is to think of the function instead of the meaning. What is it doing? What is the function of an emperor? What is the function of a wheel of fortune? What is the function of a tower? You know, and so you look past maybe the blasted tower and you think, what does a tower do? It isolates, protects, it imprisons, you know, all of these things. What else did I have to say that did not make it into the last video because of technology or me being stupid? I think that's the key points. The main thing, again, is that, you know, you don't want to be intimidated by the trumps, and the tarot is elastic. It really does fit the need of the question. I say this a lot, and there are people who I think have a valid point. I think the people who disagree with me on this tend to be really, really psychic, which I'm not. There's a temptation when you see a card that doesn't seem to fit the question to suggest to the client or to yourself that the question doesn't matter and that the card trumps the question, but I don't think that's true 99.9% of the time. Sometimes you might do a reading where your whole body says it's this other thing. I can only count one time in my life where I remember doing a reading like that. Once in 20 years. Maybe it just means I'm not very good at this, but I'm a really good reader. I mean, I'm just going to like own that for a hot second. So I know what my skill is. I think for most of us, it's important to apply the rule of the cards always answer the question, not something else. Unless you get this completely, you know, intense, full body experience of like, this is something else, or this person needs to know this thing. But again, I feel like if you have that power, most of the time you're probably not even using cards. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that. Hopefully this will actually make it onto YouTube at some point, because again, this is the third attempt to get it out there. But I hope you're well. I hope this is helpful, and be good.